I'm Indy and this is another Great War weapons special. Now, we've done a whole bunch of these where we've talked about the rifles and the small arms used by many of the European nations, and we've done them with our friend Othais from the awesome YouTube channel C&Rsenal, and he is with us here today, and today we're going to be talking about American rifles of the First World War.
All right, so I want to get something out of the way because for a number of years we had people wanting me to cover what was the previous rifle. Remember, we did handguns and we talked about the Colt New Army. The previous rifle for the US would have been the Krag-Jorgensen from the Spanish-American War. And the failures of the Krag-Jorgensen would lead to the later standard Springfield 1903 that we'll see in a moment. But a lot of people wanted me to talk about this gun because it was used in a training purpose in World War I. But then there was an argument about whether or not it ever made it to Europe. And it turns out some engineer units actually did take the Krag with a fixed amount of ammunition that was very hard for them to resupply. And later they would just be swapped to either foreign weapons like the short magazine Lee Enfield, or they would be given a Springfield eventually. So some of these did actually make it over. Probably not frontline service, but hey, it counts. They got the punch mark in. And a lot of people like the Krag-Jorgensen, so it's worth probably a mention. So let me get this on in where you can see it. Now this gun came out before people were completely obsessed with stripper clips and end blocks. Actually, I lie, that were still pretty much available, but the US decided they wanted dump loading. So the idea is that you open up this side gate, throw your 5 rounds in loose, close it up, and it deposits them all the way on the other side of the action where they can then be picked up by this tray. And part of that is so that you have an easier time single loading one round if you wanted to fire without the use of the magazine. This used to be an old sort of standard of we don't want to burn through all the ammo, and with America being a frontier army, it kind of makes sense that they wouldn't want to just sort of shoot through their magazines. They'd want to just carefully load one at a time and make their shots count. Anyway, so turn down bolt handle, basically a single locking lug. In theory there are 2, but the way these were fitted by the factory, you kind of lose that. There's too much of a margin now, and so the strength is fairly low. They can only handle the 30-40 Krag cartridge. They could not make the leap to, say, the later 30-06 that America would adopt. So basically they had a soft point where it was time to give up on this particular design after the Spanish-American War. So what happened was the US won that war very handily, but they noticed that in infantry fighting, their reload speeds, overall distance of their shots, and accuracy were lower than the Spanish that they were fighting. And so, rather smartly, even though they had won that conflict, they said, we need to look at the enemy's weapon and we need to get something a little bit better than this Krag-Jorgensen. So they would adopt a variation of the Mauser in the Springfield 1903. So what this is this is an American version of the Mauser rifle. Now they started with the Spanish 1893, but then they must have observed some of the 1898s or some other designs because there's some other features that come in here that are not specifically from the Spanish Mauser. But if we take a closer look, you can probably see that heritage. So again, just like the Mausers we've seen previously, we have a cocking shroud, a flag safety, the cocking piece at the rear, bolt handle back behind the receiver, closed bridge, and then 2 front locking lugs with a full extractor. This is a Mauser rifle. It's just been adapted by the US. It also has a unique magazine cutoff so that you can, again, either single load or fire from the magazine. The US is still thinking of saving their shots. There was some argument over the rear sight. They ultimately went with a modification of the Buffington, which is a sort of delicate looking, finely adjustable sight. And then for all the sort of fighting that went into the sight, after you get up past about, I'm trying to think of the exact measurement, but I want to say it's past 1,400 yards or so, this sight is actually not calculated correctly. So long range shots were a little difficult until that was fixed later on. And then from there, full handguard, you guys know what these sort of military rifles look like otherwise. The Springfield does take on the stripper clip, which is a very good feature because you have to think about the math here. If you have a gun with no magazine, a single loader, all right, and you load 1 round and fire it, load 1 round and fire it, load 1 round and fire it, that gives you 3 rounds. Well, if it's a magazine gun but has no rapid feed system, no rapid loading system rather, so a tube magazine or like the Krag with a dump load, the time it takes you to load 1 round versus 3 is 3 times. So if I want to put in 1 round in the gun and then fire it, 1 round, fire it, versus putting all 3 in, and then firing it 3 times, and then putting all 3 in one by one and firing it 3 times. Basically, they come out almost the same. Without rapid loading, without some sort of packet that takes all the ammo together, a single shot rifle versus one with a magazine, when you divide it over the course of a battle, both soldiers will roughly fire the same number of shots. The only advantage to the magazine is that when you need a burst of gunshots, like a cavalry breakthrough or a change in the line, you can then burst the magazine, but you're back down to 0, and you now have to take the time to either load that magazine all the way up, or you're back to that 1 at a time firing rate. So a stripper clip is very important, and that's why the US and many other countries would ultimately move away from something even like a marginal benefit like dump loading the Krag, only a tiny bit faster than single loading. Stripper clips are the way to go, M-block clips are the way to go, and nowadays detachable magazines are the way to go. In the case of this gun, stripper clip, front locking lugs, very strong action, extremely powerful 30-06 cartridge, one of the heavier hitters of the war, and ultimately though a fairly light rifle, so sometimes a bit aggressive for this combination, but most US soldiers really love this gun. It's a universal short rifle, so it was very maneuverable. We did not adopt a full-length long rifle like we saw with Germany and France and things like that, so these were very handy in the trenches. This was a good fit for World War I in a bolt-action conflict.
And this is where we started. So where did we go from here?
Well, the 1903 would not be produced in enough numbers to satisfy U.S. demand for the war. As a matter of fact, despite being the official gun of the U.S. in World War I, it was not the most common. There were actually millions of another design produced starting in 1917, and they outnumbered this gun basically 2 to 1. So while almost, most of the photos show photos of this gun because they were careful to sort of stay with that sort of American exceptionalism even when they were doing the photography, and this remained the official gun even after the war despite some debate, this was not the most common gun on the US battlefield. The most common gun would actually be the 1917, which I have to dig just a bit to get out. Ooh. Now, we probably mentioned this briefly on the British episode because this is actually derived from the British Pattern 13, later Pattern 14 rifle. So before the war, the British wanted a very long-range, very long-range, very flat-shooting, lighter cartridge, basically like a small diameter Magnum cartridge. The idea is that they were coming off of the war in Africa, and they were worried about long open spaces, and they basically want to create a very precise, very long-range, very accurate rifle. In that case, they were going to adopt a small bore, high-velocity bullet, and that didn't go so well because war broke out, so they had to take that same gun and produce it in 303 and have it produced in the US commercially. The reason for that is because to get the US to produce Lee Enfields would be very complicated, and it takes a number of years to sort of spool up and get used to how to produce a Lee Enfield, because it's a fairly complicated gun to make. We talk about this in our Lee Enfield episode and in our Pattern 14 episodes. So the UK has us producing Pattern 14s for them, and then when the US enters the war, well, they have the factories that were producing the Pattern 14s turn around and produce this, the 1917, which is the same gun without the volley sights and now chambered in 30-06. And because of losing the rim, there's actually enough room in the magazine that you can fit 6 shots instead of the standard 5, although the stripper clips still only came in 5-round clips. So if we take a look, this is another Mauser-derived weapon. We see our cocking shroud, cocking piece, we see our front locking lugs and long extractor, although in this case it's cock on close. We compress the spring as we close the bolt versus compressing it as we open the bolt. It has a dogleg bolt that puts you down by the trigger. It's a very heavy gun with a very large, heavy barrel, very clear sights, and then most importantly on this at the rear, we have a rear aperture sight. So you look through a little peephole in order to see that front sight. Yeah, these same sights would be adapted ever so slightly to work on the Browning automatic rifle because these are some exceptional sights.
And what is it that's so exceptional about them? What makes them, well, you said the other one was inaccurate over, say, 1,400 yards and stuff.
It's interesting. Inaccurate is the right word because the gun, the Springfield 1903 is precise far past 1,400 yards, but the problem is the sights were calculated incorrectly. So the gun, we also had this problem with the original Browning 1917 machine gun, and so they had to replace those sights as well. And it was only figured out during the war. So it made for certain conflicts where you want to fire over the heads of your friendlies at the enemy, Well, you don't want to get those calculations wrong. That's how you take friendly fire. So this one is set up properly. It's calculated correctly. These guns chamber the same 30-06 cartridge. They're much heavier and a little longer than the 1903. So troops didn't like them as much on first sight because they'd pick them up, and this is just a brick by comparison. It's not nearly as mobile or light. However, they were preferred by marksmen because the British were obsessed with fixing their precision problems from the previous short magazine Lee Enfields. The Lee Enfield's a beautiful rifle, and a lot of people argue with me. Check out our episodes on what I'm talking about here, but those guns, you have to have a certain amount of knowledge and very careful manufacture to get them to be accurate because they used thinner barrels, lighter materials. They didn't use a stepped barrel. They had a sort of buffer in them and everything like that. Don't worry about the details. The short answer is when you shoot a gun, it vibrates, it heats up, and if the barrel's not bedded properly or the barrel's not heavy enough or the barrel's not this or that, you will start to get some wandering depending on temperature or, distance or whatever. This gun, however, the British really scientifically went at trying to make the most accurate gun they could get. And so even though it wasn't designed for the 30-06 cartridge, it does a fantastic job. And these would be retained even for sniping purposes through World War II. Like, they are very good, accurate guns.
I'm always fascinated when we see just the sometimes slow developments and sometimes a real, an instant thing and stuff, like maybe not as dramatic a changes from like black powder, but still, this is I think my favorite part of these. So, and where are we going from here?
Well, I have to talk about another 1903, interestingly, but before I leave the 1917, I want to say one more thing. That rear aperture sight, you look through it, it's a little circle. You'll automatically center because people just want to center the front post. It made training a lot faster. It made it easier to see what you were pointing at and much faster sort of rapid fire, or rather acquisition and fire. And then the aperture sight, like I said, would be applied to like the Browning automatic rifle. And then after the war, the U.S. would actually go back and consider making this the official U.S. weapon. The Springfield won out in that regard, but they still added a rear aperture sight to that gun because they liked that part of this design so much, because the rear aperture is a really good idea. May from our series actually ranks this among her favorite rifles of the war, hands down. In terms of just layout, good ergonomics, and rapid fire and accurate fire. I just happen to have something. This is not a widespread rifle, but a lot of people might find this curious. This is the Springfield 1903 Air Service. Now, these were extremely limited use. They were basically in trial in the air when the war ended. So maybe a half dozen were up in the planes being tried out. This was designed as a backup weapon for if the machine guns failed in the plane. This is actually a perfect example of miscommunication during the war. People always talk about this gun being invented in the war and that gun being invented in the war. And the truth is, it was much more of an evolutionary process. There were thousands of designs before the war, many of them underappreciated. And then during the war, some died off and some sort of bred. They were produced more because they were useful. Well, this is one of those weird chances where they had a chance to innovate and they kind of messed it up. So the American Expeditionary Force flyboys say that they want a light, semi-automatic, but still somewhat hard-hitting carbine for use in the planes in case the machine guns jam. Well, they're thinking Winchester, like 1907s, 1910s, with nice heavy-hitting cartridges, but maybe they want a little hotter than that even though. They're going, and 351's not doing it, 401 might, but and we have a whole episode coming up on those guns, but the U.S. government doesn't have a way to produce those, and they're already running out a bunch of these Springfields, and they say, well, let's just take what we're already making and adapt it for air use. And they basically missed the point. They put a 25-round magazine on this thing. They cut down the stock. They modify the sights to be a nice open buckhorn. Those are all good things for trying to use out of an airplane, but it's still a bolt action, which was at the very core of what the AEF was asking was like, can we get a semi-automatic rifle? And they just said, here's a bolt action. And so the plane guys were kind of like, we're not into this thing. And then luckily the war ended before it got any more embarrassing than that. These are quite rare. Most of them were turned back into regular rifles or disposed of because they were so unpopular. This just happens to be an original, which is pretty cool. And that's just a little story of how a lot of people sort of expect all these secret weapons of war to be better, but a lot of times the sort of secret weapons or the unheard of weapons were much worse, and that's why we don't hear about them. Along the same vein, we've already done an episode on the Pedersen device, which was an attempt to take the Springfield 1903 and make it semi-automatic with a pistol caliber cartridge. This was a secret weapon that was supposed to be released in the spring of 1919, but of course the war ended. And I'm going to tell you from what we did, we were lucky we did not issue those guns. That would have been a huge waste of resources and maybe even a waste of lives. They were not a very good design. But you can go check that out on our channel as well.
And it's interesting you said that, because I've always pronounced it Peterson, so it's Pedersen, right?
To my knowledge, it's Pedersen, but who knows? People were calling the U.S. World War II rifle the Garand, or sorry, I'm getting it backwards now. They would call it the Garand because it had been written that way. And then the man himself, in an article, wrote down phonetically how to pronounce his name. He said his name was Garand. So we've spent 50 years saying Garand, but he called it Garand. And I think, honestly, it doesn't matter. Once you know what you're talking about, it's a little pedantic to get worried about it. Now, in terms of long arms, we are out of rifles, but there's something else I want to mention. There were 2 combat shotguns and then a number of commercial shotguns with the U.S. in the war. This happens to be the Remington Model 10. This is actually the rarer one, and yet it's the one I have on hand. I don't currently have a World War I Winchester 97. There are some slight differences by the time you get to World War II, and those tend to be much more plentiful. Following the war, I'll tell you about this in a second, but basically following the war, since the shotguns weren't really retained, a lot of attrition happened on the original Winchesters and Remingtons because they were sort of turned back into more commercial style shotguns, because generally people didn't favor the handguard or bayonet lug for sporting purposes, and a lot of them were surplused. So it can be hard to get these in original condition. But so this is a trench shotgun. In this case, it has a bayonet lug that would take the same bayonet as that 1917 rifle, because there were many more of those produced than the Springfield bayonets. And then it has this one has a wood handguard. The Winchesters had a nice perforated steel metal handguard. And the whole idea here is that you can get a hold of the shotgun while it's warm so that you can still use the bayonet when it's attached, even after firing. The problem with this, though, is that as much as there's a big sort of fan club for American shotguns in war, a lot of that comes from World War II experience, in which the shotguns were fairly effective. In World War I, they were not. Now, I've already done an episode on this, but in that time, I've worked with another researcher, and we've managed to turn up documentation from the National Archives in the US. And the truth is, the soldiers hated these trench shotguns. And I'm going to get a lot of blowback on that, I know. Just hold out for my episode. I'm going to have absolute proof of this in memos and other things that were written by the U.S. Ordnance Department, sworn statements, things like that. But it all came down to the ammo, because we were issuing 12-gauge paper shell cartridges in the muddy trenches of World War I. Not even waxed paper, paper shell. Later, they'd try wax cartridges. Later, they'd try brass jacket, like just pure brass cased shotgun shells, which have their own problems. But for the most of the service life of the shotguns in World War I, you were lucky to get 2 shots out of it before it jammed up from the moisture and buildup in the magazine tube from having swollen paper cartridges in them. So they were only really used effectively for like night raids, because then one shot's not a big deal.
Othais, so we've said a lot, certainly in Out of the Trenches, and people have asked about it, that the Germans particularly complained about the American use of trench shotguns, saying that it was an immoral or unethical, whatever you want to call it, weapon to be used in the war. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, that was often taken as a marker that these were incredibly effective. And I admit, I fell for that too. If you watch our episode on these, I kind of mentioned, hey, the Germans got real riled. They must have had a problem with them. But like I said, the US side said, nope, these are not working very well. And the truth is, the Germans probably suffered very few casualties to guns like these. But here's the thing. Germany had been in trouble in the media since the rape of Belgium. Like, they had all this pitted against them, and actually we're going to do a whole episode just on the Belgian Comblains to explain how that whole situation kicked off, with the Germans sort of reading one sort of people as civilian terrorists and the Belgians reading them as a military force, and that's what sort of kicked off that whole misunderstanding. And we've got a rifle that sort of represents that story. We'll get there eventually. But Germany had bad press, and they're launching gas and all these other things. So one of the things you want to go with is, okay, you're the bad guy on the world stage. You will grab onto anything you can. You've already been told that you have serrated bayonets and gas and that you're killing civilians and all this other stuff. Well, the Germans would do 2 things that really stand out in small arms world. They would say that the US was using shotguns, and then therefore that's a war crime. And they'd also point at Britain and say that Britain was intentionally making dum-dum bullets, snub-nosed bullets, in order to maim their own soldiers, both of which are kind of ridiculous. Like, there's German footage of taking a bullet and shoving it into the magazine cut off of a Lee Enfield and snapping the tip off and being like, look, they designed their guns so that you can make dum-dum ammo, which is just silly. And so is sort of the claim of the shotgun being an unnecessary weapon of war in the case of conflict in trenches with gas and everything else. But it's just one of those things, it's political. It's just them sort of pushing back. It doesn't actually mean that these were all that effective, unfortunately. Now again, they would do fine in World War II because they had better ammo. Really, it's not the gun, it's the ammunition. But unfortunately, with the ammo they had, they were very unpopular. And I kind of can't wait to get into that story because people really sort of assume the other way around.
Well, how did they not see problems coming with paper cartridges? You know, having it wrapped in paper. How did they not think, oh, this might be a problem in a muddy, filthy, wintry war?
It's more than likely that they just bought up commercial ammo like they would do for any of this stuff when they needed to go. Like, you're thinking this is the first really widespread issue of shotgun. The Winchester 97 was popular. As a matter of fact, I should put this down. I have a Winchester 97 commercial shotgun. A lot of these were sort of brought over to the Philippines in shortened configuration and used militarily there, and they did quite well because of their sort of limited use and not sustained exposure to trench fighting. Like, you keep it in your cabin or whatever in the Philippines, and yes, the cartridges could get a little soggy, but mostly you could store them well, load them, go out on patrol, use them, come back, store them again, whatever it takes. What they don't figure on is they're going to spend days and days and days at the front in a trench in muddy, wet conditions. That's what really swelled up those cartridges while they're sitting in the magazine tube unattended, so you don't even necessarily know that there's a problem until you start pumping this thing and nothing's coming out. So I get the oversight, and they tried to correct it, but realistically, shotguns represented a very small portion of the overall US loadout, so it's not like they wanted to put a ton of effort into them versus getting more of what they really needed. Commercial shotguns like this one with the long barrel and everything, just literally sporting purposes, the kind that you go out for bird hunting. A lot of these were bought by the US and used at, say, prison camps or factory guards or things like that. You can see a lot of photos of American servicemen with big old shotguns shouldered from everything from like Winchester to Remington and things like that. Just whoever happened to have a long arm that they could sort of put on their shoulder and free up a proper gun for the front line. You'll see some of that as well. Without the cartridge problem, the shotgun is actually very effective in trench combat. Like, it's not hard to imagine. They only issued double-aught buckshot. I get this a lot. People are like, well, they had birdshot for this and blah, blah, blah. And maybe a few cases would sneak in here and there, but the way the US inventory system was set up, they only had buckshot. But when they could get birdshot, they could use it for sort of side hunting or shooting down carrier pigeons or things like that. Generally, they didn't have that ammo available, so it didn't happen as much as people like to think. But I'm sure some of it got up there, or some people were careful with their buckshot, or they just fired enough to hit the thing. We did some testing because there's an old myth that you could return a grenade with a shotgun. So we actually went out there and got some reproduction German stick grenades, threw them up over a hill, and tried shooting them with buckshot, which actually took a lot of arrangement because buckshot is not really safe to fire into the air, so we had to make sure of our backdrop and everything. But the thing about buckshot is you got to imagine you're shooting however many pellets, you know, depending 7 or 5, it gets into different sizes, but you're shooting pellets of what is essentially 32 ACP. So you get a big burst of 32 ACP sized pellets. And so in that regard, it's kind of like every shot is like a half mag dump of a pocket pistol. And so when you do that in a trench, it's actually fairly effective. The problem is you just couldn't keep a reliable stream of those things coming because of the cartridges.
And what about the rifles? How do they stack up effectively compared to some of the European counterparts that we've seen?
On the world stage, the U.S. weapons were honestly, in this case, superior. And I try not to toot that horn, but the Springfield 1903 is a very handy short rifle. It could have some minor improvements done to it, but realistically, it was as good or better than most of the stuff that was on the field at that time. There were no mechanical problems with it. We're not seeing any of these Ross rifle issues or anything like that. It's very accurate. There's no problems with it. Even with those sort of sight miscalibrations, nobody was really using those ranges anyway because trench warfare, mostly up close, like we see a lot of guns shorten their length. We see smaller, like things tend to tighten up after World War I because we realize we're not firing at multiple thousands of yards. For this 1917, that was a clearly superior rifle. It was kind of heavy. You didn't really want to have to haul it everywhere you went, but realistically, it did everything that the Ross rifle should have been able to do, but couldn't. So it was very accurate, hard hitting, easy to maintain, beautiful sights. very adaptable to being scoped. Like the 1917 is just a beautiful platform overall with very good ergonomics. So fantastic gun. Britain had the P-14, like I said. They almost didn't issue them at all. They really kept them for home guard use because they weren't the standard Lee Enfield, even though they were in many ways superior. The U.S. had no qualms about that. The U.S. sent them right up to the front line and used them heavily and found a lot of love for them. That's cleared it for now. There's obviously automatics and things that we don't have here because of, laws and effort, but for rifles and pistols, that's pretty much the spread. We have episodes for most of the U.S. long arms now. We're working on them for the pistols, so as you get a chance to come by the show, maybe subscribe and see it when it turns up. If you're wondering why they're not there yet, it's because we like to go nice and deep and get all the facts before we say anything. We don't want to assume that what's sort of the general zeitgeist is actually true. We're not going off of Wikipedia. We're going and looking at original sources whenever possible.
Okay, everybody, and thank you, Othais, once again. That was fascinating and that was fantastic. Now, if you would like to see his episode about the Peterson device, you can click right here for that. Now, Othais, you want to say goodbye to everybody?
Yep. Thank you guys for watching this special. And if you get curious about any of this stuff, come check out our channel. I promise it's apolitical. It's just a nice history lesson that's sort of wrapped around the development of a small arm. You can learn all sorts of extra stuff by studying one thing.
And that is C&Rsenal. C&Rsenal. Okay, well, we will see you next time.